A joint investigation by 60 Minutes and The Washington Post revealed explosive findings on how Congress may have helped disarm the Drug Enforcement Administration amid the opioid crisis. Because of that report, Congressman Tom Marino, an architect of that policy, was forced to withdraw his name from consideration to be President Trump's drug czar. But the underlying issue is getting worse. Drug overdose deaths have more than doubled in the United States over the past decade. And the CDC estimates nearly 200,000 people have died from opioid overdoses from 1999 to 2015. For more on this, we're joined by Washington Post reporters Lenny Bertstein and Scott Higham. Welcome to you both. Incredible reporting. Lenny, I want to begin with you. You've both reported extensively on this crisis. Give us an idea of how Congress actually, in critics' view, made the problem worse.
Well, what Congress did is that it took away the DEA's most potent weapon against these huge companies that distribute opioids to pharmacies and doctors and other places where you and I purchase them and consume them. So these are the companies that bring the opioids, the pills, from manufacturers down to the dispensers. And what the DEA used to be able to do when in the most egregious cases was to go in there and immediately lock up their drugs and say, you guys are ignoring the law to such an extent that we're going to stop the flow of drugs right here, right now. Congress took that away.
And explain, if you could, Scott, how did this law come to be in the first place?
Well, you know, the DEA for years was trying to get on top of this problem, and they began by, locking up doctors, going after bad pharmacies, shutting down pill mills. But they quickly realized they were kind of playing a game of whack-a-mole, and as soon as they would, arrest a doctor or shut down a pill mill, another one would open. So they went up the supply chain up to the distribution level that Lenny was just mentioning, and they began to do enforcement actions against those companies, and they began to hit them with fines. They began to lock up their drugs, and the companies started to push back. They began to lobby Congress. They began to recruit some of the best and brightest people from the DEA, from this tiny division within the DEA that regulates the pharmaceutical industry, put them on their payrolls, bring them into the law firms that represented the industry. And one of those lawyers, a senior DEA lawyer, helped actually craft this legislation that Tom Marino then introduced into the House of Representatives.
And I wonder, Lenny, could you just elaborate on Congressman Marino's involvement? What was his role when it comes to this legislation?
Well, one of the things that has gotten a little bit lost is that Congressman Marino not only introduced the law, the bill that eventually made its way through both houses and became something of a little bit of a compromise, but the version that he introduced was much more onerous. It would have been much more difficult for the DEA to do its job if the version that he introduced actually had passed. He wanted to have the DEA show actual intent on the part of these companies to violate the law or to keep the drugs, allow the drugs onto the street.
And why is that more onerous? Explain why. Because intent is hard to prove.
Extremely hard to prove. How would you be able to say that a company that distributed drugs to a pharmacy a week ago or 2 weeks ago had any intent to contribute to imminent danger to the public? It would have been impossible. So that did get watered down a little bit, but not much. It's still almost impossible for the DEA to use that tool.
And let's talk about the whistleblower, Joseph Ranazisi. Those conversations that he had, what did they reveal about the effort that was being made to put pressure on people within the DEA to perhaps affect the course of their work? Let me direct that at you, Scott.
Well, Joe said that, that they were going great guns for a while, and a lot of the interviews that we've done supports that with people who are out in the field, working for the DEA, working in the trenches, in these communities, in these towns where they were seeing people, literally dying left and right. And they felt like they were finally starting to make a difference. And then when these companies started fighting back, they realized that suddenly cases they were sending down to Washington were languishing, and they weren't going anywhere. And they were being asked by lawyers at the DEA headquarters to get more evidence, to get expert witnesses, to transcribe every interview. Suddenly it was like one hurdle after another. And the DEA supervisors and investigators in the field started to feel like their cases were being intentionally slowed down. And that slowdown was documented by the chief administrative law judge of the DEA, who started to complain in memos that we obtained under the Freedom of Information Act, saying that, you know, this is a national program. Why don't I have any cases? I have so few cases that I've got to, you know, my judges have nothing to work on, and I have to farm them out to other federal agencies. What are you guys doing? So it was becoming a really big problem.
As we mentioned, Congressman Marino withdrew his name from consideration for drug czar, and I want to read a little bit of the response that he issued earlier this week. He said in part, "I insist on correcting the record regarding the false accusations and unfair reporting to which I have been subjected." It went on to say in this one-page statement, "I find it sad and disheartening that the news media have left behind any concept of balanced reporting and credited conspiracy theories from individuals seeking to avert blame from their own failures to address the opioid crisis that proliferated during their tenure." And I'd like to get both your responses to this. Lenny, what's your reaction to that response?
Well, if that's what we did, then why did Congressman Marino withdraw? He withdrew about 48 hours after our story ran, after, you know, he and others had a lot of time to look this over and to see what we were saying. And I think that the idea that Congressman Marino was going to go into the towns, small towns of this country or larger cities of this country where the opioid epidemic is killing people and represent the face of drug policy in this country is absurd given the bills that he introduced. And
what's your reaction, Scott?
Well, the congressman has never disputed a single fact in our reporting, either in our reporting or the 60 Minutes piece. And so I think we should just let the facts speak for themselves.
And what else has happened, Scott, since your report aired and was published?
Well, in addition to the congressman withdrawing his nomination, a number of members of Congress have now introduced legislation seeking a repeal or a revision of this law. There are Democrats and Republicans who see this as a nonpartisan issue. This epidemic knows no political boundaries. There are lots of people who have died, and it doesn't matter what political party they're from. This is a national problem. It's not a political problem. And so we'll see what happens with that. I mean, I think if the more members of Congress who read the Chief Administrative Law Judge's 115-page analysis of what this bill does to the DEA, the more members will come forward and realize that this law needs to be addressed.
That's incredible reporting. Lenny Bertstein and Scott Higham in Washington, thank you both for your time. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, Lenny.
Thank you.